certain figures just change the game, don't they? And I think it's safe to say Geno Auriemma is one of those figures, especially in a world as competitive as coaching. And, you brought us some really interesting material on this, including this awesome breakdown from this YouTube podcast. It really got us thinking.
For sure. I mean, you're talking about someone with 11 national championships, over 1,200 wins as the head coach for UConn women's basketball. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. Like, what even constitutes a truly amazing season for someone like that?
Right. And, the big question that this podcast really made us think about was whether the 2024 season, given everything surrounding that season, could actually be considered his greatest coaching achievement ever. And that's a pretty bold statement when you consider his entire career.
Totally. To get into that, though, we really need to look at the whole picture of his journey with UConn. This podcast actually put together a pretty cool countdown of what it considers his top 5 coaching moments, which I think is a perfect starting point for understanding what makes 2024 so unique.
Awesome. Let's get into it. So the podcast kicks things off at number 5 with the 1995 season. And, for anyone who might not be super familiar with UConn's history, this wasn't just a good year. It was a huge deal.
Absolutely. That 1995 season was when the program won its very first national championship. And they did it in style with a perfect 35-0 record. But what's really interesting and what the podcast really dug into wasn't just the wins themselves, but Geno's ability to really connect with his players on a psychological level. It went beyond X's and O's. He fostered this unshakable belief within Rebecca Lobo and that whole team. They talked about things like his pre-game speeches before those huge games and the way he managed player confidence after close calls. It suggests that there was this very deliberate approach to the mental game, almost like a CEO navigating a high-stakes business deal.
Yeah, it really shows that coaching at that level isn't just about plays and strategy. There's a whole mental aspect to it. And moving on to number 4, we get to the beginning of the Diana Taurasi era in 2002. It's hard to imagine women's basketball without her.
You can't. The podcast makes a great point about how the Taurasi era brought in this period of insane success, like back-to-back national titles in 2003 and 2004. It just shows how good Geno is, not only at spotting amazing talent, but also at cultivating it. And as we all know, Taurasi went on to be one of the greatest. And it's interesting to think about the immediate impact Taurasi had compared to the rebuilding vibe we saw in 2024.
Definitely a turning point.
Yeah.
And for number 3, the podcast highlights that unbelievable 90-game win streak from 2009 to 2010. I remember watching that, and it felt almost unreal. Like they were just on another level.
It was kind of mind-blowing. Breaking the UCLA men's record for most consecutive wins was massive. It was a statement that echoed way beyond basketball. The podcast even talked about the impact it had on women's sports as a whole. It showed the world what women's basketball could be.
And Geno, being Geno, had that classic quote during that streak. "We don't think about streaks. We think about standards." So perfectly sums up his drive. It really sticks with you, doesn't it? This whole idea of a culture where even a 90-game win streak is just a stepping stone on the path to something even bigger. It makes you wonder how he creates that kind of mindset within a team.
For sure. You get the sense that it's about pushing boundaries and setting the bar higher and higher.
Okay, down to number 2. 2016, Breanna Stewart's four-peat. 4 national championships in a row. That's unheard of.
Absolutely unheard of. To win 4 straight titles in any NCAA sport is nuts. And it really showed off Geno's skill at recruiting top players and then helping them grow consistently over their college careers. Stewart was obviously an incredible player, but there's no way they would achieve that without Geno's system and his coaching.
Right. And now, the moment of truth. The top spot on the podcast's countdown is 2024. And this is where the core question of our deep dive really comes into play. The podcast called it the ultimate rebuild, which is a pretty intriguing way to frame it. So we've seen all this crazy success, but the podcast argues that 2024 might be his greatest coaching achievement, even compared to all of that. So let's break down why they say that.
It's a fascinating argument because by UConn standards, they'd gone through what some might even call a Final Four drought. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, but for a powerhouse like UConn, even a couple of seasons without reaching the Final Four is a big deal. And that, combined with some serious injuries and a lot of roster turnover, created a totally different kind of pressure around the team. The podcast even mentioned that some people were starting to whisper things like Geno's lost his touch.
Yeah, there was definitely a different energy around the program. It wasn't that same expectation of total domination. It was more like, can they get back to the top? And the podcast really hones in on 2 specific aspects of his coaching in 2024 that they think made the difference. His tactical genius and the stuff you can't really measure, the intangibles.
Right. So first, let's talk tactics. Early in the season, Paige Buchers, who's a key player for them, had some injury issues, which forced Geno to rethink his entire approach. And the podcast also talked about how some new players really stepped up. They didn't mention specific names, but they implied that Geno played a big role in helping those players take on bigger roles. Maybe he shifted to different defensive schemes, tweaked his offensive sets to fit the new players' strengths. Maybe they moved away from mention a previous typical UConn strategy based on general basketball knowledge, e.g. a heavy reliance on post play, and towards something more like mention a potential new one, e.g. a faster-paced, perimeter-oriented attack. It showed how adaptable he can be. And of course, there were those huge wins against South Carolina and Iowa, especially that Iowa game with the whole Buchers versus Clark rematch narrative. It just felt like they had that fire back.
It was a different UConn team. They were resilient, they could adapt, and that takes us to the intangibles, which are probably even more important when you consider this rebuild storyline.
Exactly. The mental toughness he instilled in that team to get through those early setbacks was obvious. The podcast even included this great quote from him: "Greatness isn't given, it's taken." And that just captures the whole attitude he cultivates in his players, this belief that you have to fight for every win, especially when you're facing obstacles.
So, taking everything into account, the legacy, those iconic moments, the challenges of 2024, where does Geno Auriemma stand in the grand scheme of things? Like when we talk about the greatest coaches of all time in women's basketball, where does he fit in? The podcast actually dove into this GOAT debate, too. It's a pretty big discussion.
It is, and it involves some seriously legendary coaches who shaped the game. You've got Pat Summitt, Tara Vanderveer. They left an undeniable mark on women's basketball. And of course, there are so many amazing, innovative coaches in the game right now who are building their own legacies.
And if you just look at the numbers, Geno's stats are insane. 11 national championships, that crazy high win percentage over such a long career, Olympic gold medals, both as an assistant coach and as the head coach. And think about how many of his players went on to have amazing careers in the WNBA and earned All-American honors. That says a lot about his ability to develop talent over decades.
Oh, absolutely. That level of sustained success is just remarkable. But the podcast did bring up some of the criticisms he gets. Like there's this whole argument about he only wins because he gets all the best recruits, which is something you hear a lot. Did the podcast explore the counter argument at all? Because that same criticism gets thrown at a lot of successful coaches in different sports. And what really separates them is what they managed to do with that talent.
Yeah, they did. They countered that by saying it's a common thing you see with coaches and programs that win consistently. The best programs naturally attract the best players. The real test is how you take that talent and turn it into a winning team, how you develop those players, how you build chemistry, how you strategize to bring out their full potential.
Exactly. And then there's this question of adapting to the game. Basketball is always evolving, new strategies pop up, players are getting more athletic, the competition is changing, and some people have said, can he really adapt to the modern game? The podcast seemed to think that the 2024 season, with all the adjustments he had to make because of injuries and new players, was kind of an answer to that question. It showed that he's still relevant and he can still adjust his tactics.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what's the final verdict? Is Geno Auriemma the absolute, undisputed best ever in women's basketball coaching? Or is it more accurate to say he's been the most dominant force in the history of the sport?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it all comes down to how you define best. It's subjective. Most dominant, though, that you can measure. And if you look at how long he's been winning and all those championships, Geno Auriemma has a pretty strong claim to that title.
To bring it back full circle, was the 2024 season Geno Auriemma's greatest coaching performance ever?
Honestly, it's hard to say for sure if it was his absolute best. Like, how do you compare a program's first ever championship, the one that starts a dynasty, to a season where they had to rebuild from the ground up and prove they could still compete? But there's no doubt that 2024 was another huge moment in his career. It showed how well he can adapt, his tactical skills, and his ability to get the best out of his players even when things are tough.
It's definitely given us a lot to think about. So, with his incredible career in mind, what do you think is the one thing, the one characteristic or moment that really defines Geno Auriemma's impact on women's basketball? And maybe even beyond that, what does that level of sustained excellence over so many years tell us that a single amazing season might not? That's something worth pondering, for sure.